Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And we got another solo album review, this time from Run the Jewels, RTJ4. So this review is harder to put together than it might seem at first glimpse. It's not my first time talking about this duo of insanely talented rappers, with LP's production and their eye for guest stars, and how well their content walks the narrow line between over-the-top fantasy, warped Adult Swim-esque imagery, and a very real grounding in real-life events. But that in and of itself can make things a little tricky, because suddenly I'm not just talking about a great duo, but one who has put out 3 of the best albums of the last decade, to which this must now face comparison. But then there was the murder of George Floyd 2 weeks ago by the police, kicking off some of the biggest protests against police brutality the world has ever seen. 2 weeks that on some level has felt like 2 years, where not only does the real world context and content provide some shocking immediacy, but also has thrown Run the Jewels into the cultural conversation in a way I don't think they've ever quite hit before. There's a chance they will have songs that hit the Hot 100 next week, and off of 2 days of sales, they made the Billboard 200. More than that, they also have Killer Mike's speech in Atlanta early in the protest, and suddenly Run the Jewels has become part of a revolutionary soundtrack and a moment that they could not have possibly intended or wanted. And for many people, it's been exactly what they've needed. Run the Jewels' fiery polemics going as far back as Run the Jewels 2 in 2014, they often felt like a blast of white-hot catharsis, even more so by RTJ4 after the election of the POS-in-chief in 2016. But that's also a different sort of weight that comes in 2020, where if you haven't seen police brutality firsthand, you're now seeing it hundreds of times over on social media, and suddenly there's a real chance not only that this might be bigger than the album or political parties in general, but that the revolution might be going further than anyone attached to this considered. Hell, I heard Killer Mike's speech in Atlanta, where you could tell that the revolution was being told in bloody detail in his art, was potentially erupting, and as someone like him who had family ties to police, I can't imagine how shaken he might have felt. And I'll be the first to say, that's not even close to being fair to this album, especially given the extremely high expectations I already had. And one reason I actually considered delaying this review for a couple of weeks until the intensity slowed down, hell, beyond just my own mental health, sometimes the all-consuming moment will warp how you perceive art, especially protest and political music. Hell, nearly every single review I have seen cites how much this album fits in right now, and that changes some level of critical introspection. And I'll admit, that's a lot to carry going into a new Run the Jewels album that looked to be doing some very different things, with features from Chainz, Pharrell, Josh Homme of Queens of the Stone Age, and Mavis Staples, alongside returns from Zack de la Rocha and Gangsta Boo. So okay, how does RTJ4 hold up? Well, I'll be very honest. I have been more conflicted about this album than I think I've been over any Run the Jewels album. Not that it's bad, far from it, it's goddamn great. But whether it holds up to all those expectations I described, and, well, let me get this out of the way. I don't think this album is better than Run the Jewels 2 or 3. It's shorter, it doesn't seem to have the insane momentum and firepower of the former, nor the expansive breadth of sound and storytelling of the latter. And while it seems like everything is set to go off, and more often than not it absolutely does, I'm just not sure it clicks in the same way. So I'm actually going to do something a little bit different with this review, because by this point we've got 4 Run the Jewels albums. We all know the formula and approach this duo is going to take, so instead I'm going to try and analyze where it might not be working for me, and maybe through the end of my reasoning come out with some sort of conclusion on where I fall on this album. Because I've been down this road before, and while this might come across as harsh, I want to drill into this. I want to figure it out. And let's start with the first and most frequent criticism I've seen, that the faux TV show structure kind of undercuts the raw firepower and seriousness on display by highlighting a degree of artificiality that just isn't present right now. And yet, like when Vince Staples did it on FM in 2018, I completely disagree with that. Yeah, Run the Jewels has always been over the top, and that can make their social commentary seem A bit odd in the juxtaposition on the surface, but if anything, I'd argue the entertainment framing is twofold commentary, half in highlighting how white culture will commodify black art to distance themselves from it, but also half in making the marriage of explosive politics and wordplay make sense in the same sphere. Now, I would also argue it makes sense given the increasingly bleak arc of the album, which starts from a position of more gleeful crime with a few more jokes before it makes the hard political pivot, and ends with some real heartfelt introspection spat in the face of executioners, literally called a few words for the firing squad radiation. But we might as well focus on the politics while we are here, and certain points on Goonies vs. E.T., namely how Killer Mike goes off on the woke for online activism and not seeing the whole truth beyond the media. Not an uncommon line of criticism from Killer Mike, but given how his words were framed and used at the Atlanta protest, it creates the context of calling out the kids for not rebelling, and yet when they do, he's saying, oh wait, not like that. Kind of ties back to the NRA speech he did too. And putting aside how millennial online activism has aided anti-capitalist organization and that's translated to real-world direct action, it's why I made a point about how real-world context warps how you might see an album like this right now, where lines about chokeholds from cops gain some frightening poignancy and how systemic police brutality has not changed, but also when it feels like history has its eyes on the streets right goddamn now. And yet that's also not to ignore how forward-thinking this project can be, where it looks at the opulent flexes and not only questions their worth in hip-hop, but the whole goddamn capitalist system around it, which they can see cracking at the seams. The prison industrial complex that penalizes being poor, and then LP will go on and slam objectivism, the prosperity gospel horseshit propagating through religion that ignores how Jesus was killed by the state for being a political agitator, and how empathy is transmuted into apathy, which is absolutely aided by the disconnection on the internet, and how even if you succeed in an unjust system, well, I mean, they don't say there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, they just have Zack de la Rocha howl to look at the slave masters posing on your dollar. Now, all that might seem a little weird on a project with 2 Chainz, but look at how his verse is framed on Out of Sight, where he's preemptively bailing his friend out of jail, where it's less about the flex and more about how he's using it to help, which in the past 2 weeks of bail funds, again, it feels all the more real. And yet what I truly love about this project is what I've loved about the last 2 Run the Jewels albums, and that it can get serious and genuinely vulnerable, questioning the weight of holding up their legacy, questioning whether or not their long hustle has been worth it in a world that's only seemed to get worse, and how both men are now realizing they've got more to lose, as they're both married, and with Killer Mike grappling with the loss of his mother, he can't escape that thought. And it's where I'll admit the more cosmic touches around Run the Jewels, coaxed through a haze of Adult Swim and heavy drugs, they took a while to gel for me, mostly in terms of contemplating time, not only in how things have not really changed that much for centuries, or have only gotten worse with demons that have not been eradicated, but they can't go back to fix it. They have to keep trudging forward on a maybe downward slope and pretty much take out whatever they can in their path, which might be another reason why they bookended the album as a TV show, if only to mildly undercut how bleak it can get. And you know what, I'll admit that arc does push me a bit away in comparison with the last 2 albums. Run the Jewels 2 was enraged and can get incredibly dark, but it could also see some of the way through the flames. And Run the Jewels 3 felt damn near aspirational in some of its revolt, whereas here, they might wind up on the wrong end of justice, but they intend for their words to live on more than even they might. Hell, more than they may even have realized, given, again, the sound of the times. But even that can't be the only thing that's pushed a bit away, especially as the writing, the punchlines, the insanely sharp hooks, they remain as potent as ever, and Killer Mike and LP even got back to trading bars opposite each other, which I really loved. So is it the production? Well, that's my question. I remember reading a quote that said that eventually Run the Jewels was stripped down everything to the point where it's just bare crushing percussion and our Killer Mike and LP to spit across, and this might be the closest they got to it on a lot of songs. And you know, I think it just comes down to a few tonal choices that don't quite click, similar to some points I had with Run the Jewels 3. I don't think it's helped by some questionable pacing at the very early beginning. I mean, Yankee and the Brave episode 4 might have all that klaxon-driven percussive crunch that could kick off really hard, but it also feels a bit short, a little abbreviated, even with that nice dash of humor and some of the interplay on the final verses. And then we go right into Ooh La La with Greg Nice and DJ Premier. And while I like the laid-back, triumphant feel of the sound, and the music video is great too, it doesn't really sustain a lot of momentum this early in the track list, and I'd argue the buzzy chop of echoing vocal samples, keys, and scratches on Out of Sight does not really help that. Even if I like all the verses here, the production didn't quite click for me. It's just not a tone I really liked, and I'd argue the album only rips into full gear by Holy Calamafuck, with its enormous trap-inflected beat switch that's ominous as all hell. And from there, hell, even when it goes into more twisted, borderline psychedelic territory like on Never Look Back, the production can still feel alien, but it's still killer, especially with the final two songs with their haunted, ominous immensity, courtesy of the touches of saxophone, and especially Mavis Staples, who has that gravitas, preceded by the bassy shudders and buzzy waves of synth on Goonies vs. E.T., the guttural guitars ripping into the klaxon trap scratch of Walking in the Snow, probably one of my favorite songs here. Then we have Pharrell's bassy skitter driving Just Money, and the Gang of Four rap rock flip on the ground below. And that's all awesome, but it's definitely not as immediate in comparison with the opening runs on previous Run the Jewels albums. And if you're not willing to give it the time, well, I do get why some folks are saying this album isn't quite grabbing them in the same way, because it didn't quite get there for me. And yet I'm also here to say that you'll want to give this the time and space to breathe with you anyway, because Run the Jewels are 4 for 4 with this, and it's likely one of the best rap albums of 2020. But that being said, I do wonder how well this will age in the popular consciousness given the moment it's tied to. I know that the more listens I gave it to digest the lyrics and mesh in with the experimentation and the production, that more of this connected, and I think outside of this moment, it will have staying power. But again, even with that, I think the last two Run the Jewels albums are a bit stronger, which is why this is a light 9 out of 10. Absolutely a recommendation, provided you hear the other two first. But in the meantime, if there's a group that packs a wallop with every single release and as of yet hasn't missed, Killer Mike and LP, man, I can only hope these two legendary bandits keep running for a long damn time. I want them and me to see that sunrise. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. You'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I kind of put off, I made the impression this might not be a full-length review, but I wound up having enough to say about it, so that's why it's here. Leave your comments down there below. Make sure to ring that bell to get up notifications, given that the way YouTube's been, you have to be able to keep track of something. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, again, I give it the times, hard on everybody. If you guys don't have cash to spare, please don't give it to me. Bail funds, the Black Lives Matter movement, there are better places to put your money than potentially contributing to my Patreon. But hey, if, at the end of it, if you have some extra to help impact my schedule, link's right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.